tapped a Mueller critic for intel chief. Dan Coats stepping down. Another Trump loyalist is in, one of his staunch defenders, Texas Congressman John Ratcliffe. The New York Times reporting that Coats was becoming, quote, the disapproving Republican elite that Trump scorned. Remember this moment when Coats found out that Russian President Vladimir Putin was coming to the White House live on television.
The White House has announced on Twitter that Vladimir Putin is coming to the White House in the fall.
Say that again?
Vladimir Putin coming
Did I
to
hear
the...
you?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's going to be special.
Not quite sure the president likes seeing that. Trump reportedly met with Ratcliffe about the job just 1 week before the Mueller hearings, and he looked like he was auditioning for the audience of one during those hearings.
Americans need to know this as they listen to the Democrats and socialists on the other side of the aisle. Volume 2 of this report was not authorized under the law to be written. I agree with the chairman this morning when he said Donald Trump is not above the law. He's not. But he damn sure shouldn't be below the law, which is where Volume 2 of this report puts him.
All right, but the Senate needs to confirm this pick, and so far the support has been tepid. Joining me now is Tim O'Brien, executive editor of Bloomberg View and author of Trump Nation, and David Rothkopf, national security expert and former editor of Foreign Policy magazine. Tim, I'll start with you on this one. What background does Congressman Ratcliffe have for this job?
Next to zero, and I'm not just being sensationalist or exaggerating. You know, he was formerly his professional job. He was the U.S. Attorney for the Eastern District of Texas. Most of the cases in that office, or what that office is known for, are patent infringement cases. They're not national security cases. They're not terrorism cases. So he has nothing in his background professionally that recommends him to this office, which involves a lot of coordinating work between national security agencies, so you can present essentially a dashboard to the president about what the president needs to know on an interagency basis. He has no experience with any of that, which obviously begs the question then, why is he being considered for the job? And I think he's being considered for the job because he's a Trump loyalist. And I think the education of Donald Trump has taught him now to populate the various heads of these agencies with people who are first and foremost loyal to him.
So, David, if in fact he is a Trump loyalist, how troublesome is it to have a partisan DNI?
Well, it's extremely troublesome. All you have to do is take the Russia case, where Trump's position has been Russia didn't really interfere, and where the Trump administration has been trying to change the subject. And if we're in the middle of another election cycle and the Russians are potentially doing the same thing they were doing before, which the FBI director said last week that they are, and this is a director of national intelligence who doesn't want to talk about it, wants to change the subject, wants to suppress the information, wants to protect the president, that's a problem. Similarly, if Trump or Barr want to go and undertake an investigation into the Obama administration and how they started their surveillance of people in the Trump campaign, and they've got one of their own who behaves in the same way that Barr does running the director of national intelligence, you might have a thumb on the scale there. And so what I see here is the formation of a kind of Praetorian Guard around Trump. Barr, Ratcliffe, Mitch McConnell,
loyalists,
loyalists who won't let the law get to him, that'll keep him above the law, who will crush his opponents, and that's really, really dangerous.
So there was this amazing moment, which I'm sure you both remember, in June of 2017, where the president was sitting at his table surrounded by all of his appointees, all of his guys. He had Tillerson there, he had Chao there, he had Priebus there, and he had Dan Coats there. And they all talked about what they felt of the president. Some of them praised the president. Coats, however, had a little bit of a different answer. Let's watch that.
Mr. President, thank you for the honor to serve the country. It's a great privilege you've given me.
I can't thank you enough for the privilege that you've given me and the leadership that you've shown.
I want to thank you for getting this country moving.
On behalf of the entire senior staff around you, Mr. President.
It's a joy to be working with the people that I have inherited And we are going to continue to provide you with the very best intelligence we can so that you can formulate policies to deal with these issues.
So interestingly enough, despite the fact that Dan Coates' last date seems is going to be August 15th, we got 1, 2, 3, 4 of those individuals that are going to be gone or gone. Coates leaving, the others all but gone. And jumping off of what David just said, Tim, it seems as if the president is choosing to surround himself with yes men, filling all of those positions with people that agree with him on every level. We know where Dan Coates stood on North Korea. He said they will not let up with their nuclear weapons. We know where he stood on Iran. He actually said that Iran is actually not developing nuclear weapons right now. He said actually Russia did interfere in the U.S. elections, all things that were the antithesis of what the president was putting out there on a daily basis.
And it's my understanding that one of the initial things that turned the president against Coates was one of the few people in the Oval Office to recommend that they not fire Jim Comey. And that stuck with the president, that he felt everyone else around him, including Jared Kushner, said you should get rid of this guy, protect yourself, get him out of the way. And Coates said you shouldn't do that. And I think one of the themes that has stayed around Dan Coates is he envisioned his job and acted in his job as someone who was serving the American people and serving the principles of the office that he inhabited. He didn't see it as a need to bow down before your fearless leader, which is what you see in those really strange cabinet meetings where everyone is on cue telling the president how great he is. And of course, someone who's a very confident leader doesn't need a bunch of yes men around them.
Hey, David, quickly, I spoke to a congressman earlier today who basically said he doesn't think that Ratcliffe is even going to be confirmed. He's going to have a lot of trouble getting to this position. Is there anybody in your orbit that you feel like could actually become, to take over Dan Coates' position, that you feel like is feasible for the president?
Well, it's interesting. The first person the president went to for this job was Devin Nunes, who is actually a worse choice than Ratcliffe. So I don't know that the president is going to end up taking my advice or the advice of the community. He wants a loyalist. And if he doesn't get Ratcliffe, and by the way, there are Republicans who've been very lukewarm on Ratcliffe. Burr has said, I don't know him. We'll see how he comes. I don't think we're going to get that. I think he's going to just keep putting people up. You showed that clip earlier, which could have been a North Korean cabinet meeting for Kim Jong-un. The only person who's still in the cabinet, Mitch McConnell's wife.
That's
yeah,
right.
Elaine Chao. Exactly. Tim O'Brien, David Rothko, thank you so much. Appreciate it, guys.
Hey, I'm Ari Melber from MSNBC. You can see more of our videos right here, or better yet, subscribe to our YouTube channel below. You could have been anywhere in the world, but you're here with us, and we appreciate that.